Good afternoon, comrades. Welcome to IRL 102, Introduction to International Relations at International Christian University in Japan. My name is Giorgio Shani, and I'll be introducing you to the basics of Marxism. We will start by looking at the question of why Marxism now. Now, as I have previously informed you, I studied international relations as an undergraduate during a period of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was committed to an ideology termed Marxist Leninism. So it was based on the ideas of Karl Marx, whose work I'll be introducing you to, and also Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who I'll also introduce you to within the context of imperialism. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which many international relations theorists, particularly realists, did not envisage, Marxism was no longer seen as relevant to international relations. Beforehand, it was relevant to international relations because a superpower, the Soviet Union, aspired to create a socialist society. Marx, as we'll see, is a socialist. He was committed to building a socialist society. So were the revolutionaries, the Bolshevik revolutionaries, who were the founders of the Soviet Union. However, although China remained a emerging communist power, China was also committed to building a socialist society based on Marxist ideas. Within international relations, it was assumed that Marxism was dead and that there are no alternatives to liberal democracy. So the end of the Cold War was seen to mark the collapse of communism and the triumph of liberalism. So we saw a resurgence of liberal internationalism within international relations theory, most notably in the democratic peace thesis. And we see this in the infamous or famous thesis put forward by Francis Fukuyama that history had indeed ended. History had ended with the victory of liberal democracy over communism. Now, we'll be returning to Fukuyama because Fukuyama bases his claims upon a particular philosophy of history, which is actually closely associated with Marxism. This is the philosophy of history of George Hegel, who I'll be introducing you to, who was a philosopher who influenced the work of Karl Marx. Hegel believed that history had a beginning and history had an end, and that history would end with an idea of equal freedom or freedom for everybody, which he believed could only exist within a constitutional state. Fukuyama, as we saw last week, believed that history had ended with the triumph of liberal democracy over communism. Marx had a different view on the end of history, but all three theorists subscribe to the idea of an end of history. So the idea in the 1990s was that history had ended with the collapse of communism, and that there was no alternative to liberal democracy as a political form. We defined liberal democracy last week in terms of a fusion of two different ideas. Liberalism, which is based on the rights of the individual, which is based on the maximization of freedom, and democracy, which is a political process whereby power is exercised by the people, for the people. So liberal democracy takes the form of a democratic system based on multi-party elections where people elect representatives. So it's a representative democracy, and liberalism takes the form here of the rights of the individual, including, and this is very important for the development of Marxist thought, right not just of life and liberty or freedom, but also property. And this gives rise to a form of economic organization called the free market, which Karl Marx termed capitalism. So the idea was that there was no alternative to liberal democracy and the free market, therefore history had ended. However, since the 1990s, in the intervening 30 years, we have seen a rising level of inequality globally. So the world 30 years ago was far more equal than it is today. Advocates of the economic system, of the free market, or what people term neoliberalism today, would argue that the world is far richer than it was before. Many subscribe to the idea of a trickle-down economy. A trickle-down economy means that wealth slowly trickles down to the masses, but the inequality initially is built into the idea of economic development. Now, this process has also been termed globalization. By globalization here, we mean the creation specifically of a global market. I may have introduced you to different understandings of globalization in different classes. But here, globalization means the creation of a global market. And we can see that the creation of a global market actually preceded the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping, the premier of China, opened up China's markets to foreign direct investment. So we can talk in terms of China joining the world capitalist economy from 1978 onwards. Of course, this was controlled by the Chinese state, and only some parts, special economic zones, were opened up to foreign direct investment from multinational corporations from overseas. However, we can talk in terms of the creation of a global economic market. So within the past 30 years, we've seen rising inequality. Initially, a lot of that inequality was concentrated within the so-called transition economies, former communist societies, most notably Russia, where the natural resources and wealth, which had previously been controlled by the state, was then privatized. So this gave rise to great inequality, where some businessmen who controlled shares in public companies were able to become multimillionaires and relocate to different parts of the world and buy soccer teams. So if we look at figures before the pandemic, and as the top 1% of the global population controlled at least 50% of global wealth. Now, it is arguable that this has increased during the pandemic. So there has been a great concentration of wealth as a result of the extension of a global market based on capitalism in the hands of individuals, and increasingly in the hands of what can be called a transnational capitalist class, the top 1%. So if we look at the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, who at the moment is trying to, I think he has already bought Twitter. He is seen as the world's richest man, and he bought Twitter with $44 billion. Now, those $44 billion are more than the gross domestic product of many developing countries within the world. So this shows you the level of inequality. And in answer to the question, why Marxism now? Why not focus on other theories of international relations, such as constructivism as an alternative to realism and liberalism? Well, the argument here is we live in a world which is characterized by global inequality, and this global inequality takes on different political forms. In other words, this global inequality may lead to conflict between different states internationally, and also conflict between classes domestically. So this is the rationale for looking at Marxism now. I mentioned the 1%. So if we look at this figure, which shows where the top 1% live, we see that the top 1% of the global population tend to live in developed societies, in developed capitalist societies. So of the wealthiest 50 million people, here 47 million people, we have almost 2/5 live in the United States. The second largest population of the wealthiest of the world population is Japan, although perhaps today China would, as the world's second largest economy, may be home to more wealthy people in total than Japan. Then we find France, the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy. So the basic argument here is that the wealthiest people tend to live in the richest, most developed societies or countries. And the wealthiest people, this is the great insight of Karl Marx, tend to control political power. Let's go back to our example of Elon Musk. So Elon Musk has bought Twitter for 44 billion. This means he is in a position to control the information which you receive through Twitter. So this shows this has political manifestations. This shows that economic power, wealth, gives you political power, influence, influence over here in the information which you have. Perhaps a better and more clear-cut example would be former President Trump. Former President Trump was a billionaire property magnate. He inherited most of his fortune. He decided to run for president. And in a capitalist society such as the United States, he was able to spend his billions in trying to promote his image. So he could out-campaign other candidates. He could run more TV commercials. Before he was banned to Twitter, he could come up with more tweets. He could have more targeted advertising in order to create a narrative which would make him a contender for the US presidency. So one central insight of Marxism is that money buys you power. And this is a central problem, Marxists argue, with liberal democracy. That within a liberal democracy, the people who control the money, people who control economic power, tend to influence political power. So Marxists argue that there needs to be a democratization of the economic system. In other words, capitalism. The idea which is closely associated with Karl Marx, he coined the term capitalism, meaning production for profit. Capitalism as an economic system is inherently unequal and gives rise to conflict and needs to be superseded, or it needs to be transformed through revolution into a socialist system, one which is based on equality. Okay, Let me briefly give you an introduction to the work of Karl Marx. This will be necessarily brief. Marx was a prolific writer and theorist, and arguably, certainly, I would say, one of the most important political theorists within the past 500 years, in terms of his ideas shaped the history of the 20th century and shaped international relations as we know it. The first point to make is he was born in what became Germany. So he was not German, he was a German speaker, but he was born in what became Germany. But he lived most of his life in exile. First in France, where he witnessed the attempted revolution of 1848 and wrote his famous Communist Manifesto. And then in London, where he wrote his work on Das Kapital, which was a history of capital, of capitalism. So Marx was a socialist. He did not invent socialism, but he tried to make it scientific. He was also, and some people have considered this significant, initially of Jewish descent. So he was seen as very much an outsider within European society, which remained very dominated by Christian ideals. Now, Marx was influenced, as I already mentioned, by the work of George Hegel and his dialectic. So he can be seen as a dialectical thinker. And I'll introduce you in the next slide to the Hegelian dialectic. Marx's own contribution to the philosophy here was to invert the Hegelian dialectic. So the Hegelian dialectic is broadly based on the idea that history proceeds through various stages of development. And in each of these stages of development, there is a dominant idea. This dominant idea contains within it contradictions. Now, Marx's great insight was to invert this dialectic. So Hegel believed, as I'll illustrate in the next slide, that ideas shape history. Marx argued that the economic system shapes ideas. The thoughts we have in our head are not our thoughts. These thoughts can be the dominant thoughts which we have in society. These thoughts are a function of our economic role. And because we have different economic roles, we have different ideas. I'll be introducing you to this later, but this is a very brief explanation of what is termed dialectical materialism. So the dialectic is from Hegel, and I'll be introducing you to the dialectic in the next slide. Materialism is based on the idea of the primacy of the economy. So to put it very simply and crudely, we need to eat before we can think. So the Hegelian dialectic is based on the idea that all human history is the history of human thoughts. Marx's idea is that our thoughts are based on the economic system which allows us to survive. He then applies this to history through the idea of historical materialism, which I'll be introducing you to. So this is the application of dialectical materialism to human history. And he posits at the end of human history a socialist society where everybody is equal. Okay, now let me briefly introduce you to the Hegelian dialectic. I should point out that Hegel is one of the most influential philosophers in certainly in Western European history. He is associated with the Enlightenment, and he is certainly one of the most complex philosophers. So I will not be able to do his work justice. In fact, I would argue that Francis Fukuyama completely misunderstands Hegel, maybe intentionally, when he argues that history ended with the triumph of liberal democracy. This is because Hegel argued that history proceeds through a dialectic where you have a thesis, and this gives rise to an antithesis. So a thesis here can be seen as an idea. Now, this idea contains within it contradictions, mujin in Japanese. So there are problems with this idea. And this gives rise to a radically different idea. And this different idea also has contradictions. Then these two ideas conflict. So they conflict. It doesn't have to be violently, but they clash. And through the process of the clashing of these ideas, there gives rise to a synthesis. Now, the synthesis contains fewer contradictions than the thesis and the antithesis. And this allows history to progress. Now, the synthesis does not mean that history is ended. There still can be contradictions within the synthesis, which is why I think that Fukuyama completely misunderstands Hegel, because he believes that liberal democracy defeats communism, and that by defeating communism, it no longer contains any contradictions, therefore history is ended. What Hegel argued was that history could potentially end once we had a system where there were no contradictions. And Hegel believed that this would happen with the establishment of the state, a constitutional state, which would recognize the rights of the individuals. So if we apply the Hegelian dialectic to history very briefly, then we can talk in terms of a history of Western Europe or Western European thought as being based on a clash between two fundamentally different ideas. One of freedom. This emerges in Greece and also in Rome. It is based on freedom through law, through rights. However, there was a contradiction here. The contradiction was that not everybody was free. There were slaves. There were different classes within Rome, the patricians, the rich people, and the plebeians, who were the working people. Now, if we look at Hegel's idea of European history, he argues that this created the grounds for Christianity to come into Europe, because Christianity was based on the idea here of equality. Everybody is equal in the eyes of God. However, the main issue here was there was, even though there was some measure of equality, this equality took over freedom. So basically, some people were not free. They were not free to think the way ideas which they had. They needed to basically do what the Catholic Church told them to. So Hegel believed that this clash between ideas of freedom and equality would give rise to a synthesis, which Fukuyama claims is a liberal democratic state, but which Hegel termed a constitutional state, where the freedom of individuals or citizens were recognized by the state, and everybody had equal freedom. Now, Marx believed that there was one fundamental problem with Hegel's dialectic. So he agreed with the dialectic, but his fundamental problem was that Hegel misunderstood how history works. And he misunderstood the way in which ideas are influenced by the economic system. So one of Marx's most influential quotations is the mode of production of material life meaning the economic system, conditions, means influences, the social, political, and intellectual life process. So the way we organize society, the ideas we have in our head, and more importantly for this course, the way we organize politics, the way power is welded, is determined by the economic system. So the mode of production refers to a way of organizing economic activity. And this mode of production gives rise to a political superstructure. So every economic system gives rise to a different form of political organization and a different form of political community. We'll be looking at it later when we look at historical materialism. But for our benefit and for of interest to the course is this application to international relations. So very crudely, a Marxist way of looking at international relations will be to look at the mode of production, to look at the mode of economic activity, and globally we can talk in terms of a world economy which is based on production for profit. This is what Marx termed capitalism. So capitalism is based on capital. Capital is the ability to invest. So having money is not enough if you spend it, but you need to invest it in the economy, and this gives rise to the dynamism of a world economy. Now, Marx believed, and we'll be looking at this later, that capitalism gave rise to two different classes, relations of production. The capitalist classes who control the means of production, and the workers. And that the capitalist class needed a way to control the workers, to make sure that the workers respected the idea of private property, respected the law, which served to institutionalize private property, and to make sure that the workers continued to work in the factories owned by the capitalists. So a state here was necessary. The state was needed by the capitalist class, what Marx called the bourgeoisie. The term bourgeois comes from the French. It means people who live within towns. So the bourgeoisie controlled the state, and the state controlled the workers. So we live in a capitalist world, and the political superstructure of a capitalist world is a world divided into different states. This constitutes a society or system of states. So basically, if we want to understand international relations, we have to look at the economic system. Okay, now I want to transition into looking at different types of Marxism in international relations. So I don't want to spend more time talking about dialectical materialism or Marxist philosophy of history, but I will introduce you to historical materialism. And I do encourage you to read more about Marx and Marxism, particularly the Communist Manifesto, which is one of the most important books written in the past 300 years, and which is pretty short. So you can, it's been translated in every language in the world. So I would encourage you to read the Communist Manifesto in order to have an understanding of Marx's way of looking at philosophy, history, and politics. So I'll introduce you to historical materialism, which is referred to classical Marxism. And the key thinker, of course, was Karl Marx. I should also mention that Karl Marx's co-author was Friedrich Engels. And Engels is very important in terms of a theory here of the state. So really, we should be talking about Marx and Engels. Marx did most of the work. So we talk in terms of Marxism, but Engels, who was also a socialist, contributed and co-authored many important works with Marx. We will then look at Marxist theories of imperialism. So Marxist theories of imperialism are based on the idea that capitalism inevitably and inherently gives rise to competition between capitalist powers, which are controlled by different classes, and this will give rise to imperialism and then war. Now, the key theorist is Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who is best known as the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution. But during the First World War, before he launched the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin was a theorist, and he was a Marxist theorist, arguably of international relations. So I think an argument could be made for saying that Lenin is one of the first international relations theorists, because he looked at how the origins of the First World War, and he saw that the origins of the First World War lay in this competition for colonies between the major European powers. And he felt, and his thesis is that capitalism gives rise to imperialism, and this gives rise to war. We will then focus on world systems theory. Now, world systems theory can be seen as an application of Lenin's ideas to relations between the developed and developing world. So Lenin died in 1924. In 1924, when he died, the Soviet Union was the world's only communist state, or socialist state, sorry. The rest of the world was controlled by empires. After the Second World War, we have a period of decolonization, and we have the emergence of the Third World. Now, as a result of decolonization, we find that these states, the majority of people throughout the world, get a measure of political freedom. However, this political freedom does not allow them to change their conditions, their material conditions. It does not impact upon their material conditions because the world economy is still controlled by capitalists. So we'll be looking at world systems theory and the very influential work of Immanuel Wallerstein, also Andre Günther Frank, but we're going to be focusing on Immanuel Wallerstein, who argued that we live in a world system which is defined by a global economy. So international relations refers to relations within this world system. Now, Wallerstein, unlike Marx and Lenin, was not a revolutionary. He was an academic. Initially, he looked at sociology of Africa, and he's focused on Africa. And his world systems theory was an account of the development of capitalism as a world system, and is a different way of looking at international relations from realists who focus on the state and liberals who focus on individuals. Okay, let us focus or briefly introduce on historical materialism. So historical materialism may be seen as the application of dialectical materialism to history. So Marx can be seen as a philosopher of history. He came up with a philosophy of history which was very influential. And Marx argued that in contrast with Hegel, so Hegel believed that all human history was a history of ideas. Hegel argued that all human history was the history of different modes of production, different ways of organizing economic activity. And within Western Europe and also Japan, because Japan had a similar structure to Western Europe, we can isolate two different modes of production and a third mode of production, which Marx hoped and thought would result from the previous modes of production. So the first mode of production which we look at is feudalism. Feudalism is based on production on the land, agricultural production. So in a feudal society, we see that there are peasants, people who work on the land, and there are people who own the land. These are the different relations of production. So the different relations of production within a feudal society would be somebody owns the land and somebody works on the land. So within Western Europe, you had political decentralization. This was in contrast to China and India, where you had an emperor or a state who controlled the mode of production. Here in Western Europe and in Japan, no one entity controlled the mode of production. You had private ownership here of land. So a feudal society was based on a form of political organization whereby you had the various landlords or the daimyo within Japan controlling different territories within a particular society and the people who worked on those territories. Now, the problem with this mode of production is that not only it was inefficient, but you could not, it would not give rise to greater levels of economic development. And also in terms of relations of production, peasants who work on a tambo, let's say, who work within a rice field or work on, who work for daimyo or landlords, have no rights. They are seen as the property of the daimyo, the baron, or whoever controlled the land. So this created an incentive for many peasants to actually leave their societies, and many of them came to cities where they freely sold their labor power, meaning that they worked, and they worked for money. They worked for money within towns, within cities, where there were jobs, factories, and this was the development of capitalism. So capitalism here is based on production for profit. So the bourgeoisie was a class of people who owned the means of production. They were the capitalists, and they needed people to work within their factories in order to create manufactured goods, which they could then sell. Now, their market were also their workers. So they needed to sell, in order to sell things, they needed to pay people so that they could buy them. This is the dynamism of capitalism. So basically, working in a factory was better than working in a tambo, than working in a rice field, or being seen as the property of a daimyo or a baron. So this created incentives for people to flock into cities. So this lecture is coming to you from still the world's largest city, Tokyo, although I think Shanghai will soon supersede it if it hasn't. The majority of people from Tokyo are not born from Tokyo. They were not from Tokyo, but most of them migrated from different parts of Kanto or from different parts of Japan and indeed the world in search of work, because within Tokyo and Yokohama, you had the development of a capitalist economy based on factories and on trade. Now, the contradiction within capitalism, and I will just very briefly mention it because this will take us into Marxist economics, which is a field in itself and deserves not only just a lecture in itself, but an entire course. Basically, capitalism was exploitative. the capitalists exploited the workers. Marx termed it the expropriation of the surplus value of a worker's labor by the capitalist. And what this meant is rising inequality. So capitalists had a vested interest to make sure that they did not pay the workers what they deserved in terms of not paying the workers their actual contribution to making a product. This was because capitalists are an unproductive class. Capitalists don't actually produce things. They don't do anything. They just create the conditions whereby production can take place. So Marx argued quite forcefully that we don't need capitalists, and that basically inevitably there will be a revolution which would overthrow capitalism, and this would give rise to a socialist society where there was a common ownership of the means of production. So where the means of organizing economic activity was in the hands not of a capitalist class, but was in the hands of everybody. Now, how does this impact on international relations? Well, we need to look here at ideas of relations of production. So we have a relations of production in terms of the capitalist class and the workers. So another famous Marx quote is the capitalist class are the grave diggers of their own grave diggers. So the idea of a grave digger is somebody who digs their own grave. Now, the argument which Marx made here is that capitalists need workers. They need workers in order to make profit. But workers don't need capitalists. And eventually, as a result of political activity, workers would understand that they no longer need capitalists, and they will overthrow the capitalist class. How do they overthrow the capitalist class? It's quite easy, because the capitalist class has centralized the means of political power in the state. So the political superstructure of capitalism is the state. So historical materialism is the application here of dialectical materialism to history, and it ends with, history ends, according to Marx, with the creation of a socialist society which is classless. So the contradiction of capitalism is that it has classes, capitalists and workers. And economically, a capitalist society is based on the exploitation of workers by capitalists. This is a contradiction. This cannot go on. Eventually, workers would overthrow the capitalist class and create a socialist society where everybody will be free. So, what happens to the state? This is where Engels is important. So, Engels is Marx's co-author, and he argued and clarified Marxist ideas after Marx's death. He argued that the state would slowly wither away. So the idea of withering away is a bit like a tree or leaves on a tree. They wither. It takes a long time to die. But the idea here is that the state would not be necessary in a socialist society. States are only necessary within a capitalist society. So how does this impact upon international relations? Well, international relations are relations between states. So this means that we live in a capitalist world economy. Now, I'll briefly move on to Lenin's theory of imperialism, which was very influential. So Lenin, as I previously mentioned, is a Marxist. He is synonymous with the Bolshevik Revolution, which he led in 1917. And before it, he was a theorist of imperialism. So as I mentioned beforehand, as I mentioned beforehand, Lenin lived during a period of the First World War. And as a Marxist, he sought to come up with an account to account for the origins of the First World War. So there was this global conflagration, a global conflict between all the main European empires, and nobody really knew what they were fighting for. But Lenin argued that basically what they were fighting for was colonies. We lived in an age of imperialism. So Lenin's idea was that imperialism was a higher stage of capitalism. What he argued was that if we look at the development of capitalism from Marx's day, so capitalism only really develops in the United Kingdom during Marx's lifetime. So Marx is the main theorist here of capitalism. But after Marx died, we have the creation of nation states. So a good example here is the creation of Germany. That's why I mentioned that Marx was not born in Germany. He was born in a place which became Germany. Germany was founded in 1870. And one of the main rationales for founding Germany, for creating Germany, was to create this free trade union where all the German-speaking principalities could get together and trade their goods without having to pay tariffs or taxes. So basically what Lenin argued was with the development of capitalism, the domestic market had been saturated. What this means is that people within England, France, Germany, Italy, etc., had already bought as many manufactured goods as they could. And capitalism was undergoing a crisis. So what capitalists needed was access to new markets and new raw materials, oil, natural resources, rubber, tea. Now, this meant a competition for colonies for the rest of the world. And if we look at a map of Africa, the famous scramble for Africa from 1870 to 1914, in 1870, we see only the coastline of Africa was colonized by European powers. But by 1914, the entire continent, with the exception of Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, was colonized by Europeans. So this shows this competition for colonies. And this gave rise to war. So this was the real reason for the origins of the First World War. It was this competition here for colonies. France and Britain had an entente cordiale, meaning that they had an understanding. They did not colonize each other's territory. But Germany had emerged in 1870, and they, along with Italy, felt that they were frozen out. Italy was established in 1860, felt that they were frozen out of colonies. And this gave rise to the First World War. So capitalist accumulation drives major capitalist states into colonial expansionism, creating the potential for an inter-imperialist war. And this is the classic Marxist way of looking at war. A war between nation states is a war between capitalist classes. There is no, in a sense, at this stage, no global capitalist class. There is a British capitalist class, a French capitalist class, a German capitalist class, an American capitalist class. All of them have different interests. They have different interests from each other and different interests from workers. And this gives rise to conflict and gives rise to expansion, trying to get colonies. You need colonies in order to have access to markets. And this creates the potential for an inter-imperialist war. So all war is related to capitalism and imperialism. Indeed, this was the standard Soviet view of the Second World War before Hitler's invasion of Russia in 1941. So Stalin, Lenin's successor, argued that the Second World War, meaning the attack of Germany on first Poland, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and then the war with England and Britain and France was an inter-imperialist war. It was a war between imperialist powers. So this was the standard view until Hitler attacked Russia and the Soviet Union, and it became the Great Patriotic War. So we can apply this. Lenin applied this to the First World War. But if we look at contemporary international relations, we can apply this certainly, and we'll be looking at it later in our case study, to Iraq and to the war on terror. So within the war on terror, there was an attack by Al-Qaeda, who were based in Afghanistan, on the United States in September 11, 2001. The United States response was first to attack and occupy Afghanistan, but then secondly, to attack and occupy Iraq. Iraq had nothing to do with the initial 9/11 attacks. There was no link between them. Now, the standard Marxist response would be to say, if we really want to know why the United States under George W. Bush invaded Iraq, it was because they needed control of Iraq's oil because of an economic crisis globally and within the United States. They needed control of oil, so they used the war on terror as a pretext to get Iraq's oil. Iraq was the world's second largest oil producer. And arguably, a Marxist view of the present conflict in the Ukraine would also look at a competition or an access for markets. Russia now is a capitalist society. It may be a state capitalist society, but it is no longer a communist society. Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union, is no longer a communist society. It is a capitalist society. And we see a competition between Russian capitalists and between Western European capitalists within the European Union for control of the Ukrainian market. And this gave rise to a conflict which we see today. Okay, now let me briefly explain world systems theory. So world systems theory builds on Lenin's insight. So if we look at Marx, Marx can be seen as what will be termed, and I will introduce this to you when we look at post-colonialism, very much a Eurocentric thinker. Eurocentric in that he looks at Europe, he looks at developments within Europe, and he sees Europe as basically the most advanced place in the world. Europe at that time meant the West. What Lenin does is show how Europe is intertwined, it depends upon, and brings into play other parts of the world. So Lenin basically internationalizes Marx's view on capitalism. Marx is looking at capitalism within Britain, within France, within Germany. Whereas what Lenin does is shows how capitalism is a global phenomenon. And he talks in terms of a core and a periphery. The core is the capitalist states. Now, these capitalist states have colonies. These colonies are where the raw materials are. This is where the oil is, where the rubber is, where steel and iron is, so and copper. So the periphery are the colonies. But there's this interesting part of the world which is neither colonized nor is it a colonial power. And this Immanuel Wallerstein, who is influenced by Marxism, introduces as the semi-periphery. So the semi-periphery is not really part of the periphery because it isn't colonized and it's not the core. And I think if we, Wallerstein's insights are particularly important when we come to examine our main question, which we've been looking at for the past 2 weeks, accounting for the rise of China, the People's Republic of China. So for Wallerstein, the People's Republic of China was neither colonized nor was it a colonial power. So it's neither part of the North, the core, nor the periphery. It is part of the semi-periphery. And the semi-periphery has the capacity for development, unlike the periphery, which is controlled by the core. This is a very brief illustration of how world systems theory analysis works. And to a large extent, it's based on Lenin's insights if we look at imperialism. So Wallerstein's great insight, and the insight which people who work on the underdevelopment position came up with, is that with freedom, with decolonization after the Second World War, Asia and Africa become independent. They join Latin America. However, their economies continue to be controlled by companies in the core. A really good example would be Ghana. Now, Ghana, which was termed the Gold Coast, was the first sub-Saharan African state to win its independence from the British. It was led by Kwame Nkrumah, and Gold Coast became Ghana. Now, Ghana is infamous or famous for its main product, cocoa. So during the colonial period, Ghana produced cocoa because the British controlled the means of production. And they said, we want you to produce cocoa. We will make it into chocolate. Cocoa is cheap, chocolate is more expensive. So Ghanaian cocoa went to the United Kingdom. Then it became chocolate bars, and it was sold to British schoolchildren. After independence, Ghana's economy is based on cocoa. It needs a market. So the British company, in this sense, Cadbury's, buys Ghanaian cocoa. And it continues to buy Ghanaian cocoa at cheap prices. So this makes it very difficult for the Ghanaian economy to develop. The same can be seen in tea. If we look at the Indian economy, if we look at Sri Lanka, Kenya, these, particularly Sri Lanka and Kenya, are based on the export of tea. So tea was a product which was introduced to those societies in many senses. Plantations were introduced by the British. So basically what you get is cheap labor and raw materials. So raw materials, tea, cocoa, oil, in particular, copper, iron, steel, going into the core. Britain, France, Japan, all the former colonial powers, Germany, Italy, and the United States. And there it is made into high-cost consumer goods. And these high-cost consumer goods are sold back to the periphery. People sell oil and buy cars. Oil is cheaper than a car. Once you buy, if you sell cars, as Japan does, then you're going to make more money exporting cars and importing oil. Also, what's important within the colonial political economy was cheap labor. So the American economic development, particularly in the southern states of the United States, was based on plantation economies. And cheap labor or indentured labor was made available through the slave trade from Africa. Indentured laborers from other parts of Asia came. So cheap labor, and also when we look at the post-colonial economy after 1945, we find the big European societies and the United States tend to import migrants to do the jobs which British, French, Italian, German, and American workers no longer want to do at cheaper rates. So this shows how the world economy develops and progresses. So if we look at the modern world system, it's based on the idea that the old Soviet view of trying to build socialism in one country. This is a catchphrase of Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union and dictator of the Soviet Union from basically 1927 up to his death in 1953. He tried to build socialism in one country within the Soviet Union, but modern world systems theorists say that this is impossible. So this explains the collapse of the Soviet Union. You can't build socialism in one country because we live in a modern capitalist economy. So the modern world system is a modern world economy. The capitalist world system is divided into a core, periphery, and semi-periphery. So basically, you can't have socialism within a particular unit. You can't have socialist states. You can either have a capitalist world economy or a socialist world economy. So the difference between these three tiers, core, semi-periphery, and periphery, is state power. It means the ability of the state to intervene in the market for the benefit of that particular state. So in other words, China can create special economic zones, and it could step in and close down those zones if it is not in its interest. Whereas a weaker state, Cuba before the 1959 revolution, could not. El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, these states which were dominated by big US plantations, could not basically say no. They could not sort of close their market and intervene because the United States would then try and change their regime. The same is true of Iraq, which was a mandated territory. So the United States then intervened and got rid of Saddam Hussein. In 1953, they did the same with the leader of Iran, Mossadegh. So the idea here is that you need to have a strong state. It's very difficult to have regime change within China. So China here can be seen as part of the semi-periphery. And this means that development here is possible. Now, I want to look at a different case study from the one which we have looked at so far, although a Marxist view can be applied to the case study of the rise of China and the response of US and Japan. So a Marxist view would be to say that the rise of China would actually give rise to conflict because it's a conflict between different capitalist classes. However, as we'll see with modern world systems theory, the idea is that capitalist classes within China also coexist within a capitalist global economy. They may have different interests, but Marxism perhaps works best in looking at relations here between North and South, meaning between those powerful states and powerful societies and those states and societies which were decolonized in what was previously seen as the Third World. So from a Marxist perspective, if we look at the war on terror, it should be understood within the context of US imperialism. So if we look at the rationale for America's invasion and occupation of Iraq, it was that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. So basically, from a realist perspective, the argument which the American administration under George W. Bush made was that it was necessary to invade Iraq because Iraq constituted a threat to the security of the United States. From a liberal internationalist perspective, the idea was regime change. Iraq was run by a dictator, Saddam Hussein, and that it was necessary to free the Iraqi people from this dictator. And this dictator also threatened the United States because it was not a liberal democracy. The Marxist view, though, is very different. So the Marxist view is to say that the United States intervened and invaded and occupied Iraq because it was interested in its main product, oil. So Iraq holds important oil reserves, which is a key requirement for the maintenance of US power and a global capitalist order. Iraq is the world's second largest producer of crude oil. The major oil companies in the world used to be American, the Seven Sisters. Now, what's important is to look within the US administration. So the idea here is that the United States, and particularly the administration of George W. Bush, was controlled by a capitalist class. And indeed, many members of the Bush administration had ties from oil companies, most infamously the Vice President Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney was head of Halliburton, which is not an oil company per se, but works within the petroleum industry. And he left Halliburton to become vice president. After the invasion and occupation of Iraq, he gave the main contract for, or the United States gave the main contract for the processing Iraqi oil and the maintenance of Iraqi oil fields to Halliburton. So the idea is that the US administration is particularly interested, its own interests are the interests of a capitalist class. They have their own interests in mind. Now, other states benefit from the hegemony of the United States. So the invasion of Iraq was against international law, but Japan, for example, did not object, unlike the invasion of Ukraine. Why? Well, Japan basically, its economy is based on the export of cars. Cars continue to run on oil. Therefore, the US invasion of Iraq benefited the Japanese economy. So other capitalist classes benefit from US hegemony, the European Union and Japan. So the main insight is that the invasion and occupation of Iraq cannot be understood in isolation from capitalism, and that capitalism gives rise to imperialism and war. Okay, very briefly, by way of conclusion, I think we can conclude by isolating or identifying four different and interrelated aspects of a Marxist theory of international relations. Firstly, material determination. What material determination means is we have to look at the economy. The ideas we have in our head are the function of an economic system which allows us to eat. So material domination. Secondly, historical determination. What this means is that history is the history of different modes of economic activity, which give rise to different relations of production. All human history is, for Marx, a history of class struggle. So classes are the main units of analysis, not states. States are important only because they're controlled by different classes. So we should be looking at companies. We should be looking at states. States do what companies tell them to, not the other way around. And finally, the inevitability of class conflict. Marxism is a theory of conflict, like realism. Conflict can only end with the creation of a socialist society. Until then, there will be conflict not between different states, but between different classes within states and globally. Okay, thank you very much. By way of further reading, I would encourage you to read Marx's The Communist Manifesto, Lenin's Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism. For summaries of the work, you can look at Linklater's chapter, Marx and Marxism in Theories of International Relations. And also, if you have time, Wallerstein's World Systems Analysis and Introduction. Thank you very much.